The day my daughter-in-law suggested I needed a guardian to handle my affairs. I should have seen it coming. But when you are 73 years old, recently widowed, and your arthritis makes opening pill bottles a daily struggle, you want to believe your family has your best interests at heart. I wanted to believe Jessica cared about me, not just the house I would lived in for 47 years. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others, what is one life lesson everyone should learn before it is too late? Share it in the comments below. Thanks. I suppose it started 6 months after Harold's funeral, when my son David moved Jessica and their twin boys into my house temporarily. The kids needed stability, they said. While they figured out their next move, David had been laid off from his construction job, and Jessica's part-time work at the dental office barely covered groceries. I understood. Families help each other. That is what Harold and I always believed. What I didn't understand was why Jessica immediately started rearranging my kitchen cabinets and telling me I kept too many medications lying around. She said it wasn't safe, that I might accidentally take the wrong pills or forget I would already taken them. The way she said it made me feel like a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own prescriptions. I would been managing my diabetes and blood pressure medications for 15 years without a single mistake, but suddenly Jessica was convinced I needed supervision. She started by moving all my medications to a locked box in her bedroom, telling me to ask whenever I needed to take something. I protested, explaining that my doctor had given me a specific schedule and I would never miss a dose. Jessica just smiled, that patient smile people use with children and elderly people they think are losing their minds. She said, "Oh, Martha, I know you think you remember, but stress can affect memory at your age. I am just helping you stay organized." The first time I had to knock on her bedroom door at 6 in the morning for my blood pressure medication, I felt humiliated. I stood there in my robe, waiting for her to find the key, while she yawned and acted like I was inconveniencing her. This was my house, my medication, my routine, and suddenly I needed permission to take care of my own health. When I mentioned this to David, he said Jessica was just being cautious because she cared about me. He said I should appreciate having someone who noticed these things. That is when I realized they thought I was slipping. They thought being widowed and elderly automatically meant I was incompetent. Harold had always handled the finances. Sure, but I would manage my own medical appointments, grocery shopping, and household maintenance for months since his death. I was lonely, not incapacitated, but Jessica had a way of pointing out every small mistake I made, every moment of forgetfulness, every sign that she interpreted as evidence of my declining capabilities. When I forgot to turn off the front porch light one morning, Jessica made a big production of checking all the switches in the house, muttering about fire hazards and electric bills. When I couldn't remember the name of the new cashier at the grocery store, Jessica exchanged a meaningful look with David and suggested maybe I shouldn't be driving alone anymore. When I mixed up the dates for my book club meeting, Jessica said maybe it was time to simplify my schedule and focus on just resting. Each incident by itself seemed minor, but together they painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on reality. The problem was, I wasn't losing anything except my patience with their condescending concern. I would raised 3 children, managed a household budget for 5 decades, and worked as a legal secretary for 25 years before retirement. I knew how to read contracts, understand legal procedures, and manage complex filing systems. But in Jessica's narrative, I was a fragile old woman who needed protecting from herself. The medication control was just the beginning. Within 2 months, Jessica had convinced David that I shouldn't be handling money anymore either. She pointed out that I would been paying bills twice sometimes, forgetting I would already written checks. What she didn't mention was that this happened exactly twice, both times in the weeks immediately after Harold's funeral, when grief was affecting my concentration. But Jessica presented these isolated incidents as evidence of a dangerous pattern. David suggested they take over my banking to help me avoid mistakes. He said it would reduce my stress and make sure nothing fell through the cracks. I agreed to let them help with bill paying, thinking they would sit with me once a week to go through expenses together. Instead, Jessica had me sign a power of attorney document, explaining that it would make everything easier since they were already living in the house and could handle the practical details. I signed it because I trusted them, because I believed they were trying to help an elderly woman manage the overwhelming responsibility of maintaining a household alone. Because the alternative, admitting I was being manipulated by my own family, felt too painful to consider. I signed it because I was tired, lonely, and grateful that someone seemed to care about my well-being. That signature changed everything. Within a week, Jessica had redirected my Social Security and pension deposits to an account I couldn't access. She explained that this would help them manage household expenses more efficiently since they were handling groceries, utilities, and home maintenance. I would still get spending money for personal needs, she assured me, but the big expenses would be handled automatically. It sounded reasonable when she explained it, especially since I would been struggling to keep track of which bills were due when. The first red flag should have been when Jessica started referring to our household expenses and our budget decisions. She would sit at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and calculators, explaining how my fixed income needed to be allocated more strategically. She pointed out that having 3 adults and 2 children in the house meant higher utility bills, more groceries, and increased wear and tear on appliances. She suggested I contribute more toward these family expenses since everyone was benefiting from shared living arrangements. I agreed because it made sense. Of course, my costs would be higher with more people in the house. Of course, I should contribute fairly to expenses. What I didn't realize was that Jessica was categorizing everything as a shared expense, including David's truck payments, the boys' school supplies, and Jessica's monthly hair appointments. My contribution to household expenses was covering their entire lifestyle while they paid for nothing. When I asked to see the budget breakdown, Jessica would sigh and say she didn't want to burden me with complicated financial details. She would summarize the highlights, groceries, utilities, insurance, and assure me everything was being handled properly. If I pressed for specifics, she would act hurt that I didn't trust her management. After all her hard work keeping everything organized, David would back her up, saying I should be grateful to have someone willing to handle the stressful stuff so I could focus on enjoying my retirement. Enjoying retirement as if I was lounging around while they handled everything out of the goodness of their hearts, as if I wasn't paying for every single expense in that house, while being treated like a dependent child who should be thankful for whatever scraps of information they chose to share. The isolation started gradually. Jessica began screening my phone calls, saying she was protecting me from telemarketers and scam artists who targeted elderly people. She would answer the phone and tell callers I was napping or not feeling well, then forget to give me messages. My sister Margaret called 3 times before Jessica finally mentioned it, casually, while she was rushing out the door. She said Margaret sounded worried about something, but Jessica had assured her I was fine and just needed rest. When I called Margaret back, she was frantic. She would been trying to reach me for days, because she would heard from our neighbor Mrs. Peterson that there were strangers living in my house. Margaret wanted to make sure I was safe and hadn't been taken advantage of by scam artists posing as helpful relatives. I laughed and explained that David and Jessica were just staying temporarily while they got back on their feet. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I was sure I felt comfortable with the arrangements. She said something and my voice sounded different, strained. I assured her everything was fine, but after we hung up, I realized Margaret was right. My voice did sound different. It sounded careful, defensive, tired. I was constantly second guessing myself, constantly seeking approval for basic decisions, constantly feeling like I needed to justify my own needs in my own house. I was starting to sound like someone who had forgotten how to be confident in their own life. Jessica must have sensed that Margaret's call had unsettled me, because she immediately launched into a concerned speech about how some family members didn't understand the challenges of caring for an elderly relative. She said people on the outside sometimes got the wrong impression and started causing drama that wasn't helpful for anyone. She suggested it might be better if I limited contact with extended family and neighbors until I felt more settled and less confused about the living arrangements. She presented this as protecting me from stress and judgment, but I recognized it for what it was: cutting off my support network so I would become more dependent on their version of reality. Unfortunately, by the time I recognized the isolation tactic, it was already working. I would stop calling friends regularly because Jessica always seemed annoyed when the phone rang. I would stop going to my book club because Jessica said driving at night wasn't safe for someone my age. I would stop chatting with neighbors because Jessica said it wasn't appropriate to discuss personal family business with outsiders. My world was shrinking daily, and Jessica was controlling the boundaries. The medical control escalated when Jessica insisted on accompanying me to doctor appointments. She said it was important for someone younger to be there to remember instructions and ask important questions I might forget. At first, I appreciated having someone to drive me and help me remember details. But Jessica didn't just accompany me. She took over completely. She would sit next to me and answer questions directed at me, explaining my symptoms and concerns, as if I couldn't speak for myself. When Dr. Williams asked how I would been feeling since my last visit, Jessica would jump in with observations about my forgetfulness, my mood changes, and her concerns about my ability to manage independently. She would describe incidents I didn't remember the same way, emphasizing confusion and frailty I didn't feel. Dr. Williams would look at me for confirmation, and I would feel pressured to agree with Jessica's assessment rather than contradict her in front of the medical professional. If I tried to clarify or offer a different perspective, Jessica would give me that patient smile and say something like, "Martha, remember we talked about this at home. You said you were having trouble keeping track of things." Then she would turn to Dr. Williams and add, "Sometimes elderly patients minimize their symptoms because they are afraid of losing independence." I started to dread those appointments because I felt like I was being discussed rather than consulted. Jessica had positioned herself as my caregiver and interpreter, and Dr. Williams seemed to accept that dynamic without questioning whether I was capable of speaking for myself. When I mentioned this to David, he said Jessica was just being thorough and making sure nothing important got missed. He said I should be grateful to have someone so attentive to my health needs. Grateful. That word came up constantly. I should be grateful for Jessica's organization, grateful for David's presence, grateful for their willingness to sacrifice their independence to take care of me. The message was clear. Expressing any dissatisfaction or asking any questions made me ungrateful, difficult, and proof that I needed even more management and supervision. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October, when I woke up with chest pains and shortness of breath. I would experienced similar symptoms once before, right after Harold's death, and Dr. Williams had explained they were likely anxiety related, but warned me to take any chest pains seriously, given my age and medical history. I needed to get to the hospital quickly to rule out a heart attack. I called for Jessica, but she was in the shower. I called for David, but he would already left for a job interview. The boys were at school. I was alone in the house with chest pains, and my car keys were nowhere to be found. Jessica had moved them weeks earlier to a location she said was more secure, but I couldn't remember where. I couldn't find my purse, couldn't find my phone, couldn't find anything I needed to get myself medical help. I sat on the edge of my bed, pressing my hand to my chest, trying to breathe deeply and decide what to do. The pain was getting worse, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I needed help immediately, but I couldn't access my own resources in my own house because Jessica had organized everything beyond my reach for my own safety and convenience. I managed to find the landline phone in the kitchen and called 911. The paramedics arrived within minutes, checked my vital signs, and determined I needed to go to the emergency room for cardiac evaluation. As they were loading me into the ambulance, Jessica emerged from the house in her bathrobe, hair wet, looking shocked and concerned. She insisted on riding with me to the hospital, explaining to the paramedics that she was my primary caregiver and needed to provide medical history. At the hospital, Jessica took charge of admissions paperwork, insurance information, and communication with medical staff. She positioned herself as essential to my care while I lay on a gurney feeling helpless and infantilized. When the doctor asked about my symptoms, Jessica described what she would observed when she found me, not what I would actually experienced. She made it sound like I would been confused and panicky, rather than appropriately concerned about potential cardiac symptoms. The tests showed elevated stress indicators, but no heart attack. The doctor recommended follow-up with my primary physician and suggested stress management techniques for anxiety. Jessica nodded knowingly and asked about medication options for elderly patients with anxiety and confusion. She described my recent forgetfulness and emotional volatility, painting a picture of someone whose mental state was deteriorating under the stress of aging and widowhood. I wanted to scream that I wasn't confused or volatile. I was frustrated and isolated. I wanted to explain that my stress wasn't caused by aging, but by losing control over my own life. But I was tired, medicated, and intimidated by Jessica's confident handling of the situation. She seemed so knowledgeable, so caring, so capable of managing everything I apparently couldn't handle myself. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to Jessica describe my limitations to medical professionals, I realized what was happening. I was being systematically dismantled. My independence, my competence, my credibility, my connections, everything that made me an autonomous adult, was being stripped away and replaced with dependency on people who benefited from my helplessness. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't as helpless as I appeared. Harold might have handled the investments, but I would spent 25 years working for Patterson, Wright & Associates, one of the most respected law firms in the county. I would typed legal briefs, filed court documents, and organized case files for attorneys, handling everything from personal injury to estate planning. I understood legal procedures, property rights, and financial regulations better than most people half my age. I also understood manipulation tactics because I would seen them used in custody cases, elder abuse situations, and family disputes. I recognized the pattern of isolation, control, and gradual erosion of the victim's credibility. I would type reports for attorneys representing elderly clients whose families had systematically gained access to their assets through power of attorney abuse. I knew what Jessica and David were doing because I would seen it documented in legal files dozens of times. The only difference was that this time I was the victim, instead of the legal secretary taking notes. That night in the hospital, I made a decision. I was going to fight back, but not the way they expected. I wasn't going to argue or confront or make scenes that would reinforce their narrative about my mental instability. I was going to use the legal knowledge they didn't know I possessed and the financial resources they thought they controlled completely. I was going to remind them that underestimating a woman my age was the biggest mistake they could make. The next morning, Jessica brought me home from the hospital with a new level of solicitous attention that felt more suffocating than caring. She would rearrange my bedroom to make it more accessible, moving my medications even further from my reach, and installing a baby monitor so she could hear if I had any problems during the night. She explained that the doctor had recommended increased supervision following my anxiety episode, and she wanted to make sure I felt safe and supported. She would also schedule a meeting with someone from Senior Services to discuss additional care options. Jessica said it was just a consultation to explore resources that might help me feel more confident about living independently. But when the social worker arrived the next day, it became clear that Jessica had already painted a detailed picture of someone whose mental and physical health were declining rapidly. The social worker, a kind but overworked woman named Patricia, asked me questions about my daily routine, my ability to manage medications, and my support system. Jessica sat beside me, occasionally correcting my answers or providing additional context that made me sound more confused and fragile than I felt. When Patricia asked if I felt safe in my current living situation, Jessica jumped in to explain how devoted she and David were to making sure I had everything I needed. Patricia recommended a series of services, including meal delivery, medication management, and regular check-ins from health aides. She also suggested that having family members involved in my care was beneficial and should be encouraged. Everything she recommended would increase my dependence on others and provide more opportunities for Jessica to position herself as my essential caregiver. After Patricia left, Jessica sat me down for what she called a heart-to-heart conversation about my future. She said the hospital episode had really scared her and made her realize how quickly things could change for someone my age. She was worried about me living alone when she and David eventually moved out, and she thought we should start planning for more permanent care arrangements. She would researched several assisted living facilities in the area and thought it might be helpful for me to visit a few just to get familiar with the options. She emphasized that this wasn't urgent, just good planning, but she wanted me to feel comfortable with the idea of having more support as I got older. She said selling the house would provide funds for quality care and remove the burden of home maintenance from my shoulders. I nodded and asked thoughtful questions about the facilities, acting like I was genuinely considering the option. But what I was really considering was how quickly Jessica had moved from managing my medications to planning my permanent institutionalization. She was already talking about selling my house, the house Harold and I had bought as newlyweds, where we would raise our children, where I would plan to live until I died. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the baby monitor transmit every breath I took to Jessica's bedroom. And I started planning my escape, not from the house, but from the trap they would build around me. I had advantages they didn't know about, starting with the safe deposit box Harold and I had maintained at First National Bank for 30 years. Jessica had found the key weeks earlier while organizing my papers, but she would dismiss it as probably containing sentimental documents and old insurance policies. She would ask casually what was in it, and I would say I couldn't remember clearly, which reinforced her belief that my memory was failing. What I hadn't mentioned was that the box contained copies of every important financial document, including the original deed to the house, Harold's life insurance policy, and detailed records of all our investments and accounts. More importantly, it contained my original will, which left everything to David, but specified that he could only inherit if he was financially responsible and emotionally stable. Harold and I had included that provision because David had gone through periods of unemployment and poor decision-making in his 20s. The will gave me complete discretion to change beneficiaries if I determined David was not capable of managing the inheritance responsibly. Jessica and David had no idea this provision existed because they would never seen the actual will, only heard general references to David being the primary beneficiary. They assumed that inheriting the house and my assets was automatic, regardless of their behavior toward me. They had no idea that legally, I still had complete control over my estate and could modify or revoke their inheritance at any time. The next morning, I told Jessica I needed to visit the bank to update my account information following the hospital visit. She immediately offered to drive me and handle whatever needed to be done, but I insisted that some things required my personal attention. I could see her calculating whether pushing too hard would make me suspicious, so she agreed, but said she would wait in the car in case I needed help. At the bank, I accessed my safe deposit box for the first time in over a year. Everything was exactly as Harold and I had left it, including the cash we would always kept for emergencies. $15,000 in $100 bills. I also retrieved the business card for attorney Patricia Wright, Harold's longtime estate planning lawyer, who I would worked with for years when I was her legal secretary. More importantly, I found the power of attorney document Harold and I had created, which was different from the one Jessica had me sign. The original document gave power of attorney to David only for specific circumstances and required annual review and renewal. The document I would sign for Jessica was much broader and had no expiration date. I needed legal advice about whether the newer document superseded the original or whether there were grounds to challenge its validity. I also retrieved Harold's life insurance policy, which Jessica and David knew about in general terms, but had never seen in detail. The policy was worth significantly more than they realized, and it included provisions for additional payouts if certain conditions were met. More importantly, it remained under my control during my lifetime, not David's, regardless of the power of attorney arrangements. When I returned to the car, Jessica asked if everything had gone smoothly. I said yes, just routine updates. Nothing complicated. She seemed satisfied with my vague response, which confirmed that she saw me as someone who couldn't understand or manage complex financial matters anyway. That afternoon, while Jessica was picking up the boys from school, I called Patricia Wright's office. Patricia remembered me immediately and was delighted to hear from me. Though concerned when I explained my current living situation, she agreed to meet with me privately to review my legal options, and we scheduled an appointment for the following week. I also called Margaret and asked if she could visit for an afternoon soon. I mentioned casually that I would been feeling isolated and would enjoy some family company. Margaret said she would been worried about me and would love to visit. We arranged for her to come the following Thursday when Jessica would be at her dental office job. The pieces were falling into place, but I had to be careful not to move too quickly. Jessica and David were watching for signs of resistance or suspicious behavior. I needed to continue appearing compliant and grateful while quietly gathering the resources I needed to reclaim my independence. The meeting with Patricia Wright confirmed my worst fears and my best hopes. She reviewed the power of attorney document I would signed and immediately identified several irregularities in how it had been presented and executed. More importantly, she explained that my original estate planning documents remained valid and gave me complete authority to revoke or modify the power of attorney at any time. Patricia also reviewed my financial statements, which I would been able to obtain by calling the bank directly and requesting copies be mailed to her office. The pattern of withdrawals and transfers showed clear evidence of financial exploitation. Jessica had been categorizing personal expenses as household necessities and using my accounts to pay for everything from David's truck insurance to her clothing purchases. Most shocking was the discovery that Jessica had opened several credit cards in my name and was making minimum payments from my accounts while running up significant balances. She would use my excellent credit history and home ownership to secure credit I never authorized. The debt she would accumulated in my name was already affecting my credit score and would continue growing if not addressed immediately. Patricia recommended immediate action to freeze the unauthorized accounts, revoke the power of attorney, and document the financial abuse for potential legal proceedings. She also suggested I consider whether I wanted to pursue criminal charges or simply focus on recovering my assets and ending the exploitation. I asked Patricia to prepare all the necessary documents to revoke Jessica's power of attorney and restore my complete control over my finances. I also asked her to research options for recovering the money that had been taken inappropriately. Finally, I asked her to review my will and advise me about changing my beneficiaries, given David's participation in the financial abuse. Patricia explained that I had every right to modify my will based on how my potential heirs treated me during my lifetime. She said David's failure to protect me from Jessica's exploitation, combined with his own participation in the scheme, provided clear grounds for removing him as primary beneficiary. She could draft a new will that would protect my assets and ensure they went to people who had genuinely cared about my well-being. Margaret's visit the following Thursday provided the emotional support I needed to move forward with my plan. She arrived while Jessica was at work, and David was job hunting, giving us 3 hours to talk privately for the first time in months. Margaret took one look at me and said, "I look tired and strained, like someone carrying too much worry." I explained everything: the medication control, the financial manipulation, the isolation from friends and family, the plans to sell my house and move me into assisted living. Margaret was horrified, but not surprised. She said she would suspected something was wrong from our limited phone conversations, but hadn't known how to help without making things worse for me. Margaret also shared some information that Patricia Wright had asked her to investigate quietly. She would spoken with several of my neighbors and discovered that Jessica had been telling people I was developing dementia and becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Jessica had positioned herself as a saint who was sacrificing her own comfort to care for a demanding elderly relative who didn't appreciate her efforts. This narrative explained why none of my neighbors had reached out when they noticed I would become less social and seemed isolated. They thought I was mentally declining, and Jessica was handling a difficult situation with grace and patience. Jessica had managed to control not just my resources, but my reputation in the community. Margaret offered to let me stay with her while I sorted out the legal and financial issues. But I decided to remain in my own house. This was my home. And I wasn't going to be driven out by people who had no legal right to control my life. Besides, I wanted to watch their faces when they realized their victim was much smarter and stronger than they would assumed. The confrontation happened the following Monday morning, when Jessica found the official legal documents on the kitchen counter. I would position them carefully where she would see them when she came down to make her coffee, knowing she always checked the mail and any papers left in common areas. The first document was a formal revocation of the power of attorney she would convince me to sign. The second was a cease and desist letter demanding immediate return of all my financial documents, account access, and decision-making authority. The third was a detailed accounting of unauthorized charges and withdrawals that needed to be repaid immediately. Jessica stood in my kitchen, still in her bathrobe, reading documents that destroyed her carefully constructed control system. She looked up at me with an expression I would never seen before, not the patient, condescending smile she used when explaining things to her confused elderly mother-in-law, but genuine panic mixed with calculation as she tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected resistance. She said, "Martha, I think there has been some misunderstanding. These legal papers are very confusing, and I am worried someone has taken advantage of your anxiety about the hospital visit to make you feel like you need to make drastic changes. We should call David and discuss this calmly before you do something you might regret." I smiled, but not the weak, grateful smile I would been wearing for months. This was the smile of someone who would spent 25 years working with attorneys and understood exactly what every word in those documents meant. I said, "Jessica, I understand these documents perfectly. I also understand that you have been using my money to pay for your family's expenses while telling me it was for household necessities. I understand that you have opened credit cards in my name without permission and used them to buy things I never authorized. And I understand that you have been planning to sell my house and move me into assisted living so you can access my inheritance while I am still alive." Jessica's face went white. She said, "That is not true. We have been helping you manage things because you were getting confused and making mistakes. Everything we have done has been to protect you and make sure you were safe. I think this hospital episode has affected your judgment, and you are not thinking clearly about who has been taking care of you." I stood up from my chair and walked to the kitchen drawer where Jessica kept my important papers locked away for my own protection. I opened the drawer easily and pulled out my birth certificate, social security card, and passport. I said, "Jessica, I am 73 years old, not 7. I don't need someone to keep my documents away from me for safekeeping. I don't need someone to control my medications, like I am a child who cannot follow directions. And I certainly don't need someone to steal money from my accounts while pretending to protect me from financial confusion." Jessica tried one more manipulation tactic. She sat down and started crying, explaining how stressful it had been to worry about me constantly, how much she would sacrifice to make sure I was safe and comfortable, how hurt she was that I would accuse her of taking advantage when all she would done was try to help. She said David would be devastated to learn that his mother didn't trust the woman who had been caring for her with such dedication. I watched her perform this emotional manipulation with the same detached interest I would felt watching attorneys examine witnesses in court. I recognized every technique: the tears, the guilt, the claims of selfless sacrifice, the threat of family disappointment. I would seen it all documented in legal files, and I knew exactly what it was worth. When Jessica finished her performance, I handed her a fourth document I hadn't left on the counter with the others. It was an eviction notice giving her and David 30 days to find alternative housing. As my house guests, they had no legal right to remain once I would ask them to leave, and I wanted them gone before they could damage my property or steal anything else. Jessica stared at the eviction notice, like it was written in a foreign language. She said, "You cannot be serious. We gave up our apartment to move in here and help you. David quit, looking for work in other cities, because we thought you needed us. We have been sacrificing our own independence to make sure you weren't alone. You cannot just throw us out because you are having some kind of paranoid episode, I said. Jessica, I can do exactly that because this is my house. And you are guests who have worn out your welcome. You didn't give up anything to help me. You moved in here because you couldn't afford your own place and saw an opportunity to live rent-free while accessing my income. David didn't sacrifice job opportunities to care for me. He has been using me as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for supporting his own family. That is when David walked in from his job interview, saw Jessica crying at the kitchen table, and demanded to know what was wrong. Jessica handed him the documents while explaining that I was having some kind of breakdown and making terrible accusations about their motives for living with me. David read through the papers with the same shocked expression Jessica had worn. But his reaction was different. Instead of trying manipulation, he went straight to anger. He said I was being ungrateful and cruel after everything they would done for me. He said I was obviously having mental health issues if I thought the people who had been taking care of me were somehow victimizing me. He said I couldn't manage on my own and would end up in the hospital again within a week if they moved out. He said I was making a huge mistake that I would regret when I realized how much I depended on their help with daily tasks I could no longer handle independently. I let him finish his speech. Then I said, David, you are absolutely right that I cannot manage some things the way I used to. My arthritis makes opening jars difficult, and my energy levels aren't what they were when I was younger. But needing help with physical tasks doesn't mean I need someone to control my finances, make my medical decisions, and plan my future without consulting me. I continued. If you had approached me honestly about your financial struggles and asked for help while respecting my independence, I would have been happy to assist my family. But instead, you and Jessica decided to treat me like an incompetent child, whose money and property you could manage however you thought best. That is not caregiving, that is exploitation. David tried a different approach. He said they would only been trying to simplify things for me and reduce my stress about complicated financial decisions. He said if I wanted more involvement in the day-to-day management, they could certainly include me more and explain everything in detail. He said we could work out a better arrangement that would make everyone comfortable. I said, David, there is no arrangement that would make me comfortable with people who lie to me, steal from me, and try to convince medical professionals that I am mentally incompetent. You and Jessica haven't been managing my affairs. You have been preparing to steal my estate while I am still alive to watch. That is when Jessica made her biggest mistake, she said. Fine, Martha. If you want to struggle on your own and make mistakes and end up sick or hurt because you are too proud to accept help, that is your choice. But don't come crawling back to us when you realize you cannot handle independence at your age. We will not be available to rescue you from the problems you are creating for yourself. I smiled and said, Jessica, I have been handling independence since before you were born. I managed a household, raised children, and worked full-time for decades without needing anyone to protect me from my own decisions. The only problems I need rescuing from are the ones you and David created by lying to me and stealing from me. Then I delivered the line I would been practicing. The real mistake here was thinking that being elderly made me stupid. I may need help opening pickle jars, but I can still read bank statements, understand legal documents, and recognize manipulation when I see it. You gambled on me being too weak or confused to fight back. You lost. David and Jessica moved out 3 weeks later, taking only their personal belongings under my careful supervision. They would manage to run up significant debt in my name, but Patricia Wright helped me dispute the unauthorized charges and recover most of the stolen funds. The credit damage would take time to repair, but the financial exploitation stopped immediately. More importantly, I would reclaim my independence, my dignity, and my confidence in my own judgment. I changed my will to leave the house to Margaret and my other assets to several charities that supported elderly abuse prevention. David would inherit nothing, and he knew it. The neighbors gradually learned the truth about what had happened, and several apologized for not reaching out when they noticed my increasing isolation. Mrs. Peterson said she would suspected something was wrong, but didn't want to interfere in family business. I understood her hesitation, but I also started volunteering with senior services to help other elderly people recognize the warning signs of family exploitation. 6 months later, I was living independently, with some practical accommodations that actually helped rather than infantilized me. I had a weekly housekeeper, grocery delivery service, and a medication organizer system that I controlled completely. I would reconnected with friends, resumed my book club participation, and even started dating a widower from my church who treated me like an intelligent adult woman instead of a fragile burden. David calls occasionally, usually when he is having financial problems, but I don't answer. Jessica sent a Christmas card with a note saying she hoped I was managing okay on my own and that I would forgiven them for any misunderstandings. I threw it away without reading it twice. The best part of reclaiming my life wasn't the financial recovery or the legal victory. It was remembering who I would always been underneath the role they would forced me to play. I wasn't a confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own decisions. I was a strong, intelligent person who would temporarily lost her way in a carefully constructed web of manipulation and emotional abuse. I learned that being elderly and needing some assistance doesn't make you vulnerable to exploitation unless you forget that needing help and surrendering control are completely different things. I learned that gratitude for genuine care shouldn't require accepting disrespect or manipulation. And I learned that underestimating someone based on their age is often the biggest mistake a manipulator can make. Most importantly, I learned that it is never too late to fight for your dignity, protect your resources, and demand the respect you deserve from people who claim to love you. Family relationships should make you feel safer and more supported, not more vulnerable and dependent. If someone's help comes with the price of your independence and self-respect, it is not help. It is exploitation wrapped in the language of care. Now when people ask how I am managing on my own at my age, I tell them I am managing the same way I always did. Carefully, intelligently, and on my own terms. The only difference is that now I make sure the people in my life earn the right to be there through genuine respect and care, not manipulation and false concern. And if anyone else tries to treat me like a confused old woman who doesn't understand her own life, they will discover what Jessica and David learned, that 73 years of experience includes learning how to spot a liar, document abuse, and fight back effectively when someone mistakes kindness for weakness. The inheritance they thought they were protecting is gone, donated to organizations that help other elderly people avoid the trap I fell into. David will have to create his own financial security instead of waiting for me to die so he can inherit the results of my lifetime of hard work and careful saving. As for me, I am spending my remaining years exactly as I choose, surrounded by people who value my wisdom rather than dismiss it, who support my independence rather than undermine it, and who see my age as evidence of strength and survival, rather than weakness and confusion. That is the lesson I want to share. Respect for elderly people isn't just politeness. It is recognition that we have survived everything life could throw at us, and learned skills that cannot be dismissed or controlled by people who underestimate what those years of experience taught us. What is your experience with family dynamics and protecting elderly relatives? Have you seen situations where good intentions cross the line into control and manipulation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself, no matter what your age. Sometimes the most important lesson we can learn is that we are never too old to fight for our dignity and independence.